Hi everybody, this is Tamara Cumming. I'm a senior lecturer at Sturt University in Bathurst, Australia, and I'm looking forward to sharing my presentation today. If you did one thing at a time, you wouldn't be doing your job. Multitasking and task rotation in early childhood educators' work. I wanted to clarify first up that educators is an inclusive term we use in Australia for all of those working directly with children. So it might include those who have a degree, a diploma, or a certificate in early childhood education. The details that I'm going to share with you today come from a project on which I'm a chief investigator. It's called Exemplary Early Childhood Educators at Work, and it's a multi-level investigation looking at the work of educators in high quality services across Australia. So the services we're looking at are long day care and preschool services. We have a team including Australian and international academics, and we're funded by the Australian government through their linkage program. That means that we have a number of industry partners who've given support for our project, including service providers, education and professional development providers, and unions. So the project has three main parts. The first part that has been completed was a random time sampling time use diary completed on iPads by over 300 participants. And that part of the research looked at what constitutes the everyday work of educators. How does work vary across qualification levels and different types of centre-based early childhood services? So that would be, I should clarify as well, this is all for children birth to 6 years. Secondly, we undertook a series of focus groups and some interviews with 111 participants, and we were particularly interested in what personal, professional and organisational resources support exemplary educators' work. We're still working on the third phase, case studies, which has been disrupted by COVID, unfortunately, but as well as looking at those resources, we're interested in the skills and dispositions that underpin the work of these exemplary educators. So as I mentioned, we collected records from 300 participants in the time use diary part of the project. And today I'm going to be reporting on follow-up focus group material from these last two things that were looked at, task rotation and multitasking. So just to give quick definitions, probably you all know what multitasking is and you've probably all done it as well. But task rotation is the number of different tasks performed within an hour, whereas multitasking is the simultaneous performance of two discrete tasks. So what we found out about task rotation from the time use diaries was that just under half of the reported activities were done for only 6 or 12 minutes each. So in other words, it's typical for educators to change from one domain or activity to another every 6 to 12 minutes, which by extension means they could be rotating tasks up to 10 times an hour. We found out about multitasking that it was reported in 61% of all diary entries. So in this chart, the primary activity is pictured in blue and the secondary activity is in red. So multitasking was most commonly reported when educators' primary activity was intentional teaching, being with children, and routine care or transition. In these cases, the blue columns make up more than 50% of the red columns. So the red columns aren't all one, any one particular task. It's a frequency for the number of times an additional task was reported. So out of those findings, in the focus groups and interviews, we were interested to hear educators' ideas about how the findings resonated with them. Are there some activities that they'd like to be spending more time in than they're able to? And just some of the experiences of task rotation and multitasking. So what we found across really all of the participants in the focus groups, I should also explain that if we went to a service, depending on who volunteered to participate, we'd have a separate focus group with the teachers, the assistants, and the room leaders. And the room leaders can be either degree qualified or not. And then we'd have an interview sometimes with the director as well. So what I'm reporting here is an aggregation of all of the responses across those position levels. So basically everybody, no matter what their qualification or their job position, said that task rotation and multitasking are just a normal part of their work. And really they felt that that was critical to being an exemplary educator, and it needed to be this way because if they're doing their job well, it's got to be flexible to meet children's needs. At the same time, however, there were differences in what it was like to be involved in high levels of task rotation and multitasking. Some educators found that it wasn't overwhelming, suspected they might be bored if they weren't as busy as they were. Others, and I think this is an interesting quote, no sense of pressure, it's what you expect it to be. And that some people, you know, it really suits them to be busy all day. For other educators, though, they felt rushed and on edge. They felt on high alert all the time. Hypervigilance was a word used in a couple of different services by people, and also that it's difficult to stop when they've been in that state all day. Another really common response, even amongst those who were generally positive about task rotation and multitasking, was the sense that nothing really gets finished and people have to cope with it. They feel guilty and question the quality of the time they are spending with the children because of how many things they're having to do. And they're feeling like they're not as present as they'd like to be with children because they have to be multitasking. So although all of these all of the educators found that, you know, task rotation and multitasking were just normal, and some found it positive, fairly positive, others found it really quite a negative experience. So what I want to talk about next is what seemed to make the difference, and in particular, what were the things that supported people to have more positive experiences of this sort of nature of work and to be able to cope well. So a very, very common discussed theme is about the staff members themselves, the attributes of being flexible and having a realistic expectation of what the job is like, understanding that it's just normal, that it's unpredictable, and people are going to need to be open-minded, be prepared to change, and those who are a bit rigid or structured in their approach to work or need that kind of work environment are probably going to struggle in early childhood practice. Some other people said that yes, there's they don't really have a problem with the changing, but the nature of the change that's required can make it a bit stressful. So it can be stressful if you need to do two tasks that don't really go very well together. And one of those was an example of going from theory brain to emotionally supporting children. Very difficult to go between those two, so to rotate between those two tasks. And similarly, a sense of stress if they're trying to be really present with children, but also expecting that they might be able to be doing observations at the same time. So I think there's more thinking and questions to be considered about why it might be that those types of tasks seem less compatible and what the time use diary data tells us about how often that's happening. So as you can see here, there's quite a lot on this slide, and that reflects the amount of response there was to talking about the ways the educators' services and the routines in the services are organised and the way that they support people to work successfully with task rotation and multitasking. So you know, quite structural things like services being able to afford to have above the minimum ratios to employ more staff than they are legally required to, or giving people more hours to ensure that everybody does get their planning time. Providing spaces and facilities that allow educators to make the most of their time off the floor, and other things like recognising that it's more valuable for an assistant to be with the children than undertaking housekeeping roles, so employing someone to do that role. In terms of routines, very interesting. People tended to either say, we have a very structured routine, and that means we can really focus on the children because that's predictable. We know what we're supposed to do next. We know what time we're doing it. So we don't have to be always trying to look around and thinking what we might do or who's available or anything like that. Other services felt it was a real strength that they were extremely flexible, that they might come in the morning and have some ideas about what will work, but being completely responsive, to what the day, in terms of the weather, the children who were arriving, what the mood was, all of those sorts of things. And I think these are quite interesting. It's quite an interesting contrast when we remember that all of the services that are, and the educators in those services are considered exemplary. So we pick the services because they're rated as exceeding in all areas and sub-areas of Australia's national quality standards. So these services are the highest quality in Australia. And so I think it's interesting that there are very different ways of operating a service and the routine within it, rather than there being just one way that seems to work commonly regardless of where a service is located. So similarly, very important to have a strong team, people who share a philosophy, and people who are willing to step in and help, and some examples of what happens if you don't have that kind of willingness and philosophy shared between the team members. I think this is the last comment there is also quite interesting, to know each other, to know what each other is strong in or less strong in, and how the other people work, so that can be considered in the way that you're working together. Relatedly is leadership styles, and there were quite a few mentions of ways that leadership is either shared or seen as a practice that other people who aren't necessarily the positional leaders are quite capable of doing. And that was a way that particularly those who were in leadership positions found it was possible to manage things. Sometimes it was delegating, but in other times it was a real, a much more flat structure, trying to see who's the most suitable person to take something on, or allowing people to take the lead. And this last category I've called conscious pedagogy, and what I'm trying to get at is the kind of combination of the way things are done and the intention and theoretical grounding behind it. So everything from the idea that in one service they really saw that everything was potentially could be intentional teaching. In other services, they embrace the idea of environment as the third teacher and really put that to work to maximise the children's engagement. Also in another case, they set up the room to support their philosophy of flexibility so that the educators could really respond quickly and well with children. And then lastly, the involvement of children in activities that might otherwise be considered separate to classroom pedagogy. So things like planning and research, developing projects with children, all of those things are done in some places together with children rather than as separate tasks. So it then doesn't create that dichotomy between something we have to do by ourselves and something we do with the children, and there's never enough time. So one of the key purposes of the Exemplary Educators at Work project is to make visible the complexity of educators' work, and in particular, how exemplary educators practice successfully. What is it that makes their practice so high quality? So I think what I've shown today, I think, demonstrates that early childhood education is a complex job. It involves very high levels of task rotation and multitasking, but that's made manageable when an educator understands and accepts that's the nature of the work, when they've got the flexibility and openness to negotiate task rotation and multitasking, and really importantly, when they have a work environment that attends to the structures and processes that support educators in their practices. I think another important takeaway message is that each service is unique. And those that seem to be operating most successfully in this norm of task rotation and multitasking were those that had shaped a work culture that responds to the type of service, the area they were in, the needs of the children and families, and what their shared philosophy was. They had one and they were all on board. So thank you for listening to the presentation today. This is a selection of academic publications from the project so far. And at the end there is also the website for the project, which we encourage you to follow. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation today. Thank you.